Okay, let's get this party started. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome you to our second author focused webinar of the summer. Today, we are going to be talking with Christa Brown, who is an incredible advocate for those who've experienced sexual abuse in the church. And she is also the author of Baptistland, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo, so I needed 1 second to see if I can get rid of this. All right, I think we fixed it. Sorry about that, folks. So we're going to be talking a lot more about Christa and her work in just a second. I just want to first introduce our organization in case there are any new folks out here who are joining us for the first time. Faithful America is the largest online community of grassroots Christians putting our faith into action for love and social justice. That frequently means pushing back on white Christian nationalism, but it also means holding church leadership accountable when they are harming people in Jesus' name. My name personally is Karli Wallace Thompson. My pronouns are she, her. I am a senior digital campaigner here at Faithful America. So if you've ever gotten one of our emails or signed one of our petitions or taken action with us in the past, you've seen a little bit of my work, and I'm always back here trying to work with folks and organize folks. It's just kind of what I do here at Faithful America. As I mentioned before, this webinar is actually part 2 in our summer series featuring authors of books that have made a big impact on us and our work here at this organization. In part 1, we spoke with Warden Way's Brian Kaler about the book that he co-wrote with Bo Underwood, which is Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. You can watch that on our YouTube channel or our Facebook channel if you'd like. We're also working on several additional installments. So if you're enjoying our author talks this summer, definitely keep an eye on your inbox because we will be talking to you about many more to come. But back to today. So how do I introduce Christa Brown in a way that will actually demonstrate the enormity of what she has done and the importance that she holds in the community of folks who have survived sexual assault in churches and in our community in general? Just trying to wrap my head around where I should start. But actually, I was just wrapping up her book yesterday, and she quoted an article, and I thought this would be the best place to start. Again, the book is Baptistland. You should definitely read it. So when Christa Brown opened her mouth about the exploitation she endured in the church, pastors began to fall one by one. It ended with the exposure of no less than 700 clerics involved in sexual abuse. 700 pastors. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. Christa was the first Baptist clergy sex abuse survivor to directly address the members of the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee at the Baptist Vatican in Nashville. She has continued to plead for reforms for nearly 20 years. She has been profiled and quoted by numerous national and international outlets, including the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Houston Chronicle, NPR, so many more. And the Religion News Association named her as one of the top 10 religious newsmakers of 2022. We are so grateful to have you here, Christa. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Karli, and I'm really happy to be with y'all today.
Yay.
And thanks to all who are listening in.
Yes, I was going to say, and thank you for everyone here joining us on Zoom. We're so happy to see all of you here. We're going to start off by having Christa read a little bit from Baptistland, and then I'm going to ask her a handful of questions, and then I would love for you all to be able to ask her some questions too. So if you have a question for Christa about Baptistland or her work for reform or anything else, please make sure you drop it here in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please don't put it in the chat because I'm not going to be actively looking at the chat, and also it moves really quickly so it can get lost there. So if you have a question while Christa and I are speaking, just pop it in the Q&A area and I'll try to make sure to ask her it before the end of the call. And I think that's it. I'm going to hand it over to you, Christa. Take it away.
All right, so I'm going to read an excerpt from Baptistland. Even though I was a Bible drill champion and had memorized countless verses, I was no match for the pastor. If anything, it was my reverence for scripture that made me all the more susceptible to his twisting of it. Lean not unto thine own understanding, he always recited, as he insisted it was a sin for me to keep trying so hard to understand. And how could I argue with the Bible? I had known it always and only as the Word of God. To have run from it would have been like running from my own soul. So little by little, I became compliant and numb. Still, I kept trying to understand. And in my stubborn efforts, my adolescent grandiosity collided with my boundless faith. He said that this was God's special role for me. I was chosen, and that I was predestined to be a helpmeet for him in his holy work of advancing God's kingdom. I believed that, in part because I wanted to believe it. Doesn't every teenager want to be special? Ye are not your own. That was another one of the Bible verses that he would berate me with. In his translation, it meant that my body existed for the service of God and that it didn't belong to me. Of course, he was the one to tell me what God wanted, because he was an anointed one, an ordained pastor, a man of God. So when he hammered away at ye are not your own and chastised me for not turning my body over to God's will, it started to make sense in my faith-addled brain. And it meshed with other lessons. From way back, I'd been taught that if I truly loved Christ, I had to be willing to die to self. So that's what I tried to do, to die to my own self. And the pastor took my sacrificial body and savaged it, all in the name of God. Be not conformed to this world, he'd recite, but be ye transformed, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. It was still another verse that he would use to insist that I shouldn't consider the standards of the world and should instead place my trust in God's will for our relationship, because God's will was perfect. This was his way of telling me that it didn't matter that he was already married, because the idea of one man, one woman was a standard of the world. And God's will wasn't limited like the world was. Yeah, it was twisted. All these years later, I still find it painful to realize that I actually believed it. How could anyone be so stupid? And yet, I was not, in fact, a stupid girl. Instead, I was a faith-filled girl, and that's different. He didn't like it when I asked too many questions. He would chastise me, asking, where would we all be if Mary hadn't trusted God, even when her special role was something she couldn't understand? For anyone raised evangelical, the answer to that question was hell. If Mary hadn't been willing to trust in what God wanted of her, however crazy it seemed, then human beings for all time eternal would be in hell without a savior. And we aren't talking some mere metaphorical hell. The church I grew up in dished out a constant threat of a hyper-violent hell. A hell where those who rejected God would burn forever in a fiery inferno without ever getting the relief of burning up. So, the admonition to be like Mary weighed heavily. Not that I ever specifically imagined I would give birth to a Christ child. I only believed what the pastor told me, that just as God had decreed a special role for Mary, so too did God have a special role for me. It wasn't my place to try to understand, but to simply live by faith in submission to God's will. As a girl who loved God, how could I have done otherwise? The option of saying no to God wasn't within the realm of possibility. I expect some will consider me blasphemous to even imagine that I was somehow like the young Mary. But I wasn't the one who first came up with these comparisons. It was the pastor who told me that I should be like Mary and have a faith like hers, trusting in God's will no matter how incomprehensible it seemed. So that's what I tried to do, to have the kind of strong faith that Mary had. None of it made any sense, but I pondered it all in my heart, just the way Mary did. Sometimes I still ponder it. The girl I was then, the girl of infinite faith, flat out terrifies me. Yet she is a part of me. To feel even an inkling of her presence in my consciousness is for my whole body to feel itself at death's door, and for my mind to sense a darkness so deep that I have to distract myself, lest screams escape my throat. I feel I could be cousin to some religious terrorist somewhere, because a part of me understands, viscerally knows, the horror of how, for love of God, someone could be convinced to do almost anything. That's the girl I was, the girl who would do anything for God.
Thank you, Krista. Whew. There's so much there. It's hard to know where to begin. But that was beautiful. Thank you. And folks, I'm going to share here in the chat a link where you can go get Baptistland. We definitely would encourage you to order it and read it. It's so amazing. I just finished it yesterday, and if you order it here, Faithful America will get a little bit of a cut of the money, but more importantly, you won't be sending your cash to that other big, large, scary online bookstore that will not be named in this space. But we'd rather not send you to them, so we will send you here. But definitely pick up the book. Oh, Krista. Um, Obviously, this is a really personal book. Like from start to finish, you talk about the abuse that you survived, not just at the hands of your pastor, but struggles and difficult family dynamics, and the way that you were abandoned when you decided to speak the truth. And I can't imagine that this was an easy book to write for you. And I really want to know what made you decide that this was the story that you wanted to share with the world, because I would imagine that was probably a pretty tough decision.
You know, this was a book that was hard to write in a lot of ways, resurrected a lot of things that aren't good things. But it also gave me cause to step back and really appreciate the life that I've made for myself, and to see that more fully as well. Um, I've worked on it for a long time, a lot of years. So, I took some reprieves during those times.
Good.
I think the why question, part of what has always motivated me has been the stories of other survivors. For example, one of the reasons I talk so much about my family is because I have heard so many other survivors, Church 2 survivors, um, talk about how when they came forward, they often wound up becoming estranged from their family, that they did not have familial support. I mean, this doesn't just affect the direct victim, the child who is sexually abused, but it disrupts whole families. And yet, that's something that most survivors do not talk about, precisely because it is so extremely painful. And that was why I decided that I really wanted to try to talk about it.
Yeah, I definitely saw some of my own story in your story. And so I do believe that's a really powerful tool and a really powerful thing that you did in being willing to share it. And we thank you for it. You talk a lot about the importance of truth telling in the book, which makes a lot of sense. And I definitely know in my own experience, anytime you're in an environment where you're expected to present a picture perfect version of yourself to the world, that leaves behind the scenes a lot of space that's very ripe and open and just waiting for abuse and nonsense to happen. But I noticed as you go through the book, the way that you talk about truth telling changes over time, and the reason for the truth telling and the power of the truth telling kind of changes throughout the book. I'd love to hear more about kind of your evolution on that.
Well, I think in the beginning, it's hard sometimes even to tell the truth to yourself, or at least it certainly was for me. Um, we work at trying for ourselves to see what is true. And man, we sure put up a lot of walls to try to avoid that sometimes, don't we? Um, and so that's, I think, always a first step, trying to see it for ourselves. Um, but, ultimately, I just think it's so necessary. And life is short. If we aren't going to reside in the truth, then I don't know. I just think life is too short not to try to reside in the truth, because truth ultimately is the catalyst for transformation, for change, for becoming our authentic selves. And that's true both individually, and it's also true institutionally, I think.
Absolutely. I'm going to actually just jump to a question that I'm seeing in the Q&A because it relates directly to this. Stephanie is asking what your suggestions are for helping women to empower themselves and empower each other to voice our truths. As you're saying, it's kind of hard to reach that place sometimes. And so what are the pieces of advice you'd give to women who are trying to figure out how they can speak their truths and talk about what happened to them?
You know, I think you have to start with letting go of a lot of guilt. It is a step by step, slow evolutionary process. And so I think every little step, when you step away from something that is untrue, applaud yourself. Uh, be good to yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Um, we have all, I think, lapsed into denial at various times in our life. That's the human tendency, to lapse into denial in the face of really uncomfortable truths. And so I would say be gentle with yourself. And at the same time, particularly for those abused in any kind of high control environment, whether that's a high control family or a high control faith group or a high control church, um, I think we have to cultivate our skepticism, and we have to be willing to do that. We've all been raised to be good, good, and to give others the benefit of the doubt, and to be nice. But I think sometimes it behooves us to cultivate our own skepticism. And when matters of faith have been so weaponized, as they often are, um, both on a micro level with individuals, and we see it in our society on a more macro level. When faith itself winds up being weaponized, then it behooves all of us to cultivate skepticism about matters of faith. And I don't think any of us need to feel guilty for that.
Yeah, amen to that. See what else have we got here. Oh, I'm just getting folks in here just saying other survivors just saying they express gratitude for you for everything that you're doing, all of your work, which 100%. Um, Speaking of skepticism, something else I feel like we should hit on, something that really comes through in the book a lot is your frustration and your skepticism around the Southern Baptist Convention, around whether reform is possible, kind of going back to the truth telling, where at one point in your story you talk about how you were trying to speak truth to power, and then you realize power doesn't want to hear it.
And power
Power's not
already
interested
knows.
in your truth.
Yeah. And power already knows.
Yeah.
So speaking truth to power, I think I viewed myself that way for a number of years, speaking truth to power, but they know already. And so nowadays, I think I speak truth, or try to speak truth at least, with and for the powerless, in solidarity with the powerless. Um, I stayed in that place for a long time of earnestly believing that if only I could show them how pervasive this problem was and the enormous harm that was being wrought in so many people's lives, that surely they would want to take steps and do something. I'm not there anymore. Those days are gone from my mind because they have had, the Southern Baptist Convention has had opportunity after opportunity to earnestly reckon with this problem, and they do not. And so I do not hold faith or trust in them as an institution anymore. And I don't think any of us should. They should have to earn trust, and they're a long ways from doing that with me.
Same.
Yeah.
I can understand that. So for folks who are still seeking reform, who are still trying to make church a safer place for congregants, who are trying to still get justice for those who've survived sexual assault in the church, if it's clear that the SBC isn't moving, what advice do you have for the folks who are still fighting this fight? And like, where do we go? What avenues of justice do you think are worth pursuing at this point?
The avenues of justice worth pursuing are legal recourse, whether that be criminal prosecutions or more likely civil lawsuits. And legal recourse is not a perfect option by a long shot, because we know that in many states, statutes of limitation are too short. They don't allow for the reality of what we know about particularly childhood sexual abuse, that there is this delay, that is a manifestation of the very harm that's done, that people sexually abused in childhood do not bring it forward, often for decades.
Right.
And so oftentimes there are not good options for legal recourse, but I still think almost everyone would do well to consult with a good sexual abuse attorney and at least get advice on your options, and know what the possibilities are. I also hope that we will see in the future, of course, I'm hoping that we will also see more states that will enact statute of limitations reform. That's needed in every state, and I hope for that. I think that is the trend, but we still have a long way to go. I also hope, we know that there's currently a Department of Justice, a federal Department of Justice investigation that's in progress still. I hope that we will also see many state attorney generals who will initiate investigations, because so many of these crimes are crimes that fall under state law. And so I hope that state attorney generals will initiate investigations, because those are the ways to bring a great deal more truth to light. And of course, the media. I'm so grateful for all the work that so many journalists have done, because in the Southern Baptist Convention, with their sexual abuse and cover-up problem, we would know almost nothing were it not for secular media. That is where we are learning things. So that too is another avenue for seeking relief. I don't think there are good avenues within the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah, just focusing on external pressure and
Yes.
accountability at this point. That absolutely makes sense. We have an attendee here who's asking, uh, what can we do to protect our children? What can we do? How can we talk to our children to make sure that they are, if they were ever to encounter something like this, that they are prepared and they are ready?
You know, you aren't going to like this answer that I give you. I'm just saying. Um, there are, of course, things we can do to make our children less vulnerable. And that is, of course, by always keeping lines of communication open,
Right.
by checking out the places and the people where we trust in which we entrust our children. But at the same time, I really believe that all children are vulnerable. It is the very nature of childhood that children are vulnerable. And so I often have the sense, that we would all wish that there were some 10-step process that we could all follow that would surely protect our children. But I don't think that exists. And the instant we feel confident that they are protected is probably the point in time when they are not. So I think we have to always be on guard. And that's not an easy thing to do, to always carry with us that sense of being on guard. But I think we have to with children.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense to me. So in chapter 19, you talk a lot about the response you got when you first started speaking out, like the hate mail you got, the nasty crank calls, the disrespect from people who were in the SBC, often coming from people who led with, I am a Christian, but, and then would say some of the most awful things you could imagine. And I mean, it's awful. And I say this as the person who, we get a not insignificant amount of hate mail here at Faithful America too for, along similar lines, but this is just next level. And imagining being an individual dealing with all of that, what gave you the courage to keep moving forward? Because I would imagine, on a gut level, you just want to run away from that nonsense.
That's certainly true. And there were days when I did not have the courage to keep moving forward. There were days when I just felt nothing but afraid. Um, that the hate was something that I was really emotionally, psychologically, intellectually just wholly unprepared for. And I didn't anticipate the great waves of it, the meanness of it. Um, and it really had a profound effect on my sense of safety as I go about in the world, my personhood. Um, and I hope what people will realize is, this hate mail that I got, I mean, I don't see this as being solely the work of, isolated rogue individuals out there who spew their hate. Because I was vilified by some of the highest leaders of the most powerful Protestant denomination in the country. Uh, these were high spiritual leaders that called me names publicly, and we don't even know the kinds of things they said privately. Things like evildoer, and saying I was just as reprehensible as a sex criminal. I was nothing more than an opportunist, a person of no integrity, a Jezebel, part of a satanic scheme. When you have very high religious leaders who are saying these kinds of things, I believe it has a trickle-down effect. So that then there are all sorts of other people out there, ordinary people, who take what they hear from those high religious leaders as a license then to be even more brutish. And I think that's what happened to me. And so I kind of put this on the shoulders of the men of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee. I think they are ultimately what brought that about.
Mm.
And
That's a
that's
shame.
not damage from childhood sexual abuse. It's not, as far as the personal damage that it inflicted on me, that's not
Yeah.
damage from childhood sexual abuse. That's not damage from the cover up of my childhood church. That's damage in the here and now from these men in high places.
Yeah. I mean, and that's something that, you talked about a bit in the book too, that it really stood out to me of how when you talk to people who were survivors and they tell you about their story, how often the greater hurt that they express to you is not in the actual sexual assault itself, which is incredibly traumatizing and horrible to go through for any human being at any point. So, like you're already talking about an incredibly high level of trauma, but that the thing that stuck with them the most was watching their communities and their families and their pastors and the people that they were taught to trust then immediately abandon them and turn their backs on them because they weren't playing the role that they were expected to play in the institution. And then seeing how that's playing out for you, then even on the higher levels, as you're talking to the leaders of this organization, and they are then completing the abandonment and completing the rejection, is just horrifying.
It is. And as you say, that, in my experience, is the most consistent commonality among the stories that clergy sex abuse survivors tell, is almost invariably they do say exactly that, that the greater harm, even greater than the sexual abuse itself, the greater harm was done by so many others who turned their back and responded in the most mean and base ways. Um, because, it is one thing to try to come to terms with the reality that a single individual did something really bad and really harmful to you. That's one thing. But then when you have to also come to terms with the reality that all sorts of other people, your whole community, everything you knew, turned its back on you and often did even worse in vilifying you and demeaning you and further shaming you and degrading you, not to mention not doing anything to help. That is a very hard thing to come to terms with.
Mm, amen to that. Yes. Um, Gosh, there's a question here. Yeah, that's so someone is asking in the chat here that, and also a good question, talking about how that weaponization of faith and the damage that that does above and beyond what one is already experiencing in a traumatic event. And I have someone here asking anonymously, how does one maintain their faith in the face of all of that? How do you hold on to it as you go through that process, right? Like once your faith has been weaponized against you, how do you find your way back to it? Because that can be a struggle, right? When church goes from being a place of safety and worship and comfort and community to being a place where you felt rejection and hurt and attacked and fear, what does the path back from that look like? What do you think? Or
I
is
think
there one?
I, well, I think it varies with the person. I do think
Yeah.
that that's exactly right. That when faith has been used to eviscerate, it is very hard then to feel safe in faith. And that's not a matter of whether you feel safe in a church or not. For many, that's a matter of how you feel inside. How do you feel safe inside in this faith that you try to hold inside, when that very thing that you hold inside is what nearly destroyed you, when that was the thing that was weaponized. And I think many clergy sex abuse survivors do not find their way back into any kind of organized faith. I mean, they may find their way into something else, and that's okay. And we need to learn to let that be okay, I think. But a great many do not find their way back into what would be considered a more traditional faith. But I think part of the process is just letting us be okay with where we are, and however that evolves. We've all been raised, I think, so many of us, at least for me, in a more fundamentalist faith, everything was pretty black and white. And
Mm-hmm.
and it is hard sometimes to kind of step into the big open sea, um, where it's just this at large kind of faith that is much more inchoate, much more nebulous. For me, that's where I am. I'm like this little raft on this big open sea. That's my faith. And I think for a very long time, those waters felt pretty stormy and yikes. um, but over time, I've kind of made peace with the big openness of it. I talk to the fishes, you know. and
I love
it's
that.
okay. I think I'm really fortunate to live in Colorado. I live in the mountains, so I'm out in the mountains a lot. And this for me is where I find some sense of the sacred, some sense of the holy, some sense of presence. Um, and I'm good with that. And I'm very grateful to have that.
That's beautiful. I like that, and I can relate to that a lot. Um, just thinking of kind of our audience here, we have a lot of clergy who are members at Faithful America, a lot of people uh, who are active in their local churches. And just thinking, kind of jumping off from that, of like, is there anything that you would say to those folks if they're trying to make their churches more welcoming spaces for folks who may have been hurt by the church in the past, right? Because there are so many people, and sexual assault being one piece of it, but also, LGBTQ folks who've been rejected by their churches. Like, we're seeing this growing group of people who don't identify with any particular religion, and a lot of them have been hurt by the church or feel rejected or afraid of some of the messaging that they've seen from right-wing churches that are not particularly caring or inclusive or looking to, make people feel welcome and safe. And so, our folks are largely folks who come out of more progressive faith traditions, but what they want to welcome folks in and they don't always know how. What are things that they can be thinking about that can make their spaces feel more safe to folks who are still struggling with that?
Well, I think things like this, having space for the conversations, holding that space for the conversations, initiating the conversations, even from the pulpit, um, about these things. I think just seeing that someone isn't fearful of talking about it can be a big opening. Um, and I'm grateful for those in the faith community and for those pastors who are really earnestly trying to do this. I went to some events in Cincinnati with the American Baptist Church there, pastor trainings and other things about my book and about Sarah Stancorp's book, Disobedient Women. And it felt so welcoming, and I felt grateful just to see this openness to trying to build a space to talk about this. And I think that's a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm seeing a question here from May, asking about kind of the relationship between the theology you grew up with and the uptick in Christian nationalism we're seeing today. And like, I know you write in your book that, the theology of Baptistland is a theology of domination. And when I'm reading that, I'm going like, absolutely. And when you're looking at a moment where, convicted felon Donald Trump is getting overwhelming support from white evangelicals in this country right now, and we're seeing, Christian movements to try to enforce a specific twisted right wing version of Christianity into our legal structure, into our state legal structures in ways that are really harmful for folks. And so do you feel like there is a cultural and theological connection there between folks who, these institutions that are covering up for rampant abuse that's going on under their watch, while they're also throwing support behind someone like Donald Trump and looking for this more authoritarian ideology within their politics?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think we see evangelical theology, which is this theology of male headship and female submissiveness, which puts everyone in a sort of hierarchy and tries to put everyone in kind of these boxes and limit people. It's it is in many ways a religion that is used to legitimize repression and oppression. Um, and I do think that we see this kind of theology being brought into the service of pursuing authoritarian ends politically, which I find enormously frightening. I mean, we see it on the micro level with the authoritarian response to people who have been sexually abused by clergy. With the initial clergy perpetrator who uses religion as a weapon for rape, and then with the surrounding church community that uses religion and talk of things like forgiveness, brings that to bear for their own authoritarian ends to protect the status quo power of the institution. So those are both kind of the micro level use of religion for authoritarian ends. But I think we see the same thing or something quite similar on a much bigger level as we bring what I would consider often fringe religious ideas into the public square to influence public policy for things like book bannings, for school boards and curriculums, for things that have the most awful effect for LGBTQ people and for hate toward trans people. And these have, I think, theological underpinnings, religious roots, but they're being brought into the public square for creating public policy. And I find that really very concerning.
Yeah, I think we all do. But yeah, I completely agree and see that connection there. And yeah. So one thing that I noticed about the book that really stood out to me, uh, just as someone who grew up in similarly challenging environments, is I really admired the way that you balance empathy with accountability. When you were talking about your family and some of the people that you grew up around, I think that's something that can be very tricky to do when you're very close to it. Understanding that you were hurt by people who were also hurt and who were dealing with their own unresolved traumas, that they were still trying to figure that out and holding space for that while also saying, but that does not excuse the action. That doesn't excuse the outcome of what happened to me or what happened to my family members or what happened to others. And I just kind of wanted to ask, like, how did you get to a place where you felt like you had that balance? What helped you getting there? Because I feel like that can be a tricky piece for people struggling with things like that.
Well, I'm old for starters. I just age kind of, we all evolve as time goes by. Um, Certainly there are many things about my family members that were just enormously, enormously painful and still are. I grieve those things. I grieve the relationships. I grieve for myself for how much some of that hurt. At the same time, though, I look at the circumstances of my parents and the constraints on their lives. And of course, they never had the opportunity to get counseling or therapy. We came from a family, I was a family of very modest means. And so, all of that, the traumas of their own lives, which were many and severe, trickled down into how they parented. And I do recognize that. At the same time, I give thanks every day that my own daughter and her children are free from so much of this intergenerational trauma. And for that, I'm grateful.
Absolutely. I love that. Uh, So you close the book with this letter to your fellow survivors of clergy sexual assault. That was absolutely beautiful. And in it, you talk a lot about the importance of solidarity within the survivor community. Like, I'll read just a little bit because I loved it so much. All of us deserve much better. All of us. If we wind up building a movement that only recognizes good survivors, those who are white, cis, heterosexual, faith filled in the right way, and nice, we will have built it on the same authoritarian theological and ideological foundation that brutalized us. Whew, that is a whole word. That was just amazing to me. And it just got me thinking of like, what are the challenges to building a survivor? Like, does that seem like something that's so challenging to build, and what can be done to encourage that kind of solidarity among folks who are struggling with the same things and pushing back against the same power sources?
You know, I think we all are people who are, all of us grow and change. At least I hope we do. Um, and, for me, I was raised with very fundamentalist thinking, which is kind of very black-white kind of thinking.
Yep.
And I think for a lot of people raised in these kinds of pretty fundamentalist, authoritarian, high control sorts of faith groups, even when we step away from it, maybe because we've been severely traumatized within it, but even when we move away from it, there's still part of us that holds a lot of that black-white thinking in our heads. And it influences. I mean, we think we've moved away, but man, it's still there, right? and
Yep.
and I think we all have to be kind of cognizant of that. And that is the best thing we can do, to be open to the holiness of all human beings, of everyone, because we do all deserve so much better. And I think this, within the survivor community, I think this is a long way from happening. We do see a lot who really want to still kind of have that box of what to me looks like a fairly narrow faith, but that's where their comfort is. And they don't want to step outside that because yikes, that looks scary outside there. But geez, fear not. um, I think
Amen.
yeah. So I guess that's all I got to say about that. Yeah,
I love it.
let's all work on
Oh,
changing ourselves,
absolutely. Um, so Erin here has a question. First wants to say that you have been such a role model to so many people. I'm going to have to send you this because I'm getting a lot fewer questions, and a lot of just Krista is amazing, and we are so grateful for her being here. But Erin wants to know if you have any words of wisdom for the people who are joining survivors on their journey to really healing and being more comfortable with themselves, for their partners and other people who are supporting them, because obviously, as we're on that healing journey, there are a lot of bumps in the road, and there are a lot of things that we have responses to and that we struggle with. And so being a good partner in that situation where you're so struggling with your faith and struggling with your self-confidence and struggling with all of these other things can be tricky. So he wants to know, do you have any advice for folks who are trying to support loved ones in that situation?
I think it must be hard. I sometimes think of my own husband and just think, oh my gosh, he has been through so much with me. And as you say, it has been very, very bumpy sometimes. Um, but I think one of the best things you can do is just to be there, to be that steady presence, to reflect back the beauty of that other person. Because one of the things that happens, I think, particularly with sexual assault and sexual abuse, is it inculcates these messages in us. It's like we absorb this, telling us, that we don't matter, that we are of no value. And so I think the very presence of another person who stays, who stays steady, sends a message that you do have value, that you do matter. Otherwise, they wouldn't stay, right? But
Yeah.
they do, and that I think that kind of thing matters more than any particular words. Um, I think it is the constancy and the presence and the steadiness that really matters. We've all had so much that we didn't have any control over. And so to have someone who restores agency to us and who restores steadiness and allows us to figure out where we are within ourselves, that's such a great gift.
Mm, indeed. Yes. Oh, that's beautiful. So one more question from the chat, I think, and then we'll have to probably wrap up soon. Someone asking, like, do you remember what the tipping point was when you decided, okay, enough. I'm gonna speak out. I'm not gonna let anyone stop you. Like, was there a particular moment that just reinforced for you that being quiet was no longer an option?
Yeah. Uh, the real turning point for me was when my own daughter began to approach the same age that I had been at the time I
Mm,
was being sexually abused. And it was as though my eyes just opened. Um, and I saw everything through new lenses. Everything that I had thought I was at fault for, everything that I carried such an enormous shame for, all of a sudden I saw this through the eyes of a mother, instead of through the memory of myself and all the shame that I had felt as a girl. I saw it through the eyes of a mother. And the one thing I knew for absolute certainty was that if anyone were to do to my daughter what had been done to me, that I would not in any way blame my daughter and that I would be absolutely furious. And that seems like a very small thing, but it was that one kernel of truth there, which I knew without any doubt. And that then led to the unraveling eventually of just about everything else.
wow. That is an amazing story and also so relatable. I also find that in my own life that sometimes it's a lot easier to see the dynamics of a situation clearly when you're standing up for someone outside of yourself than it is when it's you. You've always got an excuse for why it's fine and you can deal with it. But when you see it externally, it's a very different dynamic.
Right, right. And then I thought of, so then I look at my own daughter, and then as a mother, like so many do, I think about all the other children. I mean,
Yeah,
then I had to speak. There was nothing else that I could do at that point. Yeah.
absolutely. And we are all so incredibly grateful to you for doing so. So try to end on an upbeat note. We usually like to close out our webinars with this. We've talked about a lot of really difficult stuff here in this conversation, but you know, curious what gives you hope? The struggle with the SBC has been difficult and you've been through so much, but what is the thing that gives you hope at the end of the day that we can make things better, that things are getting better, that there's possibility?
You know, um, there are many things that look pretty hopeless. Southern Baptist Convention is one of them, but there are lots of other things. You can enumerate them: systemic racism, climate change, all sorts of things. But ultimately, I hold hope in human beings. I hold hope in the goodness of human beings. I hold hope in whatever these unseen threads are that connect us as human beings, the holiness of that connection that we don't see, and yet we all feel it. Um, that gives me hope. The the knowledge that there are many, many others out there um, who are working to bring truth to light, who have the audacity to stand in defiance of power structures, oppressive power structures. And even if those structures do not change, I think I see the hopefulness of simply that lies in that defiance. Um, I don't think that, I think oftentimes the change we seek, the justice we seek, we don't see it in our own lifetime.
Mhm.
But we plant the seeds anyway, um, in the hope for an orchard that lies beyond us. And I think there's a lot of people out there planting seeds. And for that, I give thanks, and that gives me hopefulness in my heart.
Yes. May we all plant seeds every single day. I love that so much, Krista, and you give me hope. I can tell you right now, looking at this Q&A, you were giving everybody here hope. So thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to answer a couple quick questions. I'm seeing a lot folks asking where they can purchase the book. If you look in the chat, I have posted a link over here that will allow you to order the book, and there'll be a little bit that'll come back to us here at Faithful America so we can keep trying to hold some of these church leaders accountable. And yes, this will be posted. We will have it up on our Facebook page and our YouTube page sometime within the next day or so. So y'all will definitely be able to watch this again, share it with your families, share it with your church members. We'd love for you to get the word out. So with that, we will wrap up. But again, thank you, Krista. Talking to you is always a blessing.
Thank you,
Uh,
Karli. Thank you so
and
much.
absolutely. And thank you to everyone who joined. It's been lovely having this conversation with you. We love you guys. Thank you. Take care. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Bye bye.